listen to me. Go and type in the word predestination or the word election or biblical election or soteriology, biblical salvation into your Google search engines. And you will see in the first 2 pages, Calvinist after Calvinist after Calvinist resource. You got questions. If you've seen that one, got questions? That's a Calvinistic resource, by the way. Most of the big internet behemoth websites that are out there on Google are giving Calvinistic answers to these questions. No wonder the resurging of Calvinism between the ages of 16 and 35 are just astronomical. Why? Because
Hello, Jeff Dollar here. Recently, Dr. Flowers republished part of his broadcast in a smaller format, which has to deal with him lamenting over the massive amount of Calvinistic material on the web, and that being the source of why there are so many Calvinists. And he goes into detail in this video. I may make another video or two in responding to some of the other parts of this video. But in this introduction, he goes into some detail as to why he believes that there are so many Calvinists out there. Let me first of all say that there really is not this great number of Calvinists overtaking the evangelical world. At least I don't believe so. I mean, there's much more than what there was, at least vocally. But I have, just until a few years ago, I had to travel half an hour to find a Presbyterian, a Bible-believing Presbyterian church to worship in. Our church, which is just a few minutes away, was not officially a Calvinistic church until the elders, about, 8 years ago, decided to change the church, and I was involved in that. It is now officially an independent Calvinistic church. So I have a church now within about 10 minutes of my house. But before that, I had to travel. And I noticed, especially when I go down south, there's churches everywhere. But it's difficult for a Calvinist to find a place to worship in some of these areas of the country. There's churches all over the place. But to find a real biblical church, as far as what my viewpoint that teaches the Reformed faith, it's not always that easy. And some that do give at least lip service to the Reformed faith, I think fall short in other areas, which makes it difficult for a biblical Calvinist to worship in. But that being the case, I wanted to examine his assertions that the reason why there are so many Calvinists has to deal with the internet. Now, that of course has something to do with it, but it's not because that Calvinism has overtaken the internet and that's the only option. I don't think it's a matter of quantity, that there's no other options, but I think it's a matter of quality. Now, when you go back into the history of this Calvinistic resurgence, this is not something that has happened within the past 10 years or 20 years of the internet. This goes way back. The Calvinism suffered greatly under in the Victorian era. The Victorians were becoming very much turned off by Calvinistic theology. And this was happening during a time of apostasy as well. If you've heard of Spurgeon and the downgrade controversy, people were jettisoning Calvinism as a harsh doctrine. At the same time, they're also jettisoning biblical Christianity by degrees. Spurgeon saw this. Spurgeon tried to correct it. He tried to bring these other Baptist churches in the Baptist Union back into more orthodox theology, to make a commitment to orthodox theology. They refused to do so. And as a result, he had to leave the Baptist Union in what was called the downgrade controversy. And the downgrade controversy didn't just get rid of Calvinism, they got rid of orthodoxy altogether in due time. So Calvinism suffered there with this great spiritual declension. Back in the 1980s and 1990s is when I began to be introduced to Calvinism, and it was not through the internet. There, of course, was no internet at that time. I was limited to the books, magazines, and people that I could hear through audio tapes and things like that. What I did have, the information I did have concerning Calvinism was all negative. I went to Hyles-Anderson College, a fundamentalist Baptist college. This college made sure that you didn't get access to Calvinistic books or any books which contradicted what they taught. In the books that I bought in this college, you'd find a magic marker going through the pages, marking out things they didn't agree with, and sometimes entire pages would be cut out of these books because they just simply didn't want us to get that information. And anything that I heard about Calvinism was all negative. It wasn't until years later when I left that college that I was able to get access to limited access to some Calvinistic works. And even then, I had no interest in it. I had been so brainwashed against it, thinking that it was a cult like the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormons, that I had no interest in reading anything Calvinistic. I was woefully ignorant of what Calvinism even taught. So with all that being the case, I still became a Calvinist. And why was it because I was suddenly bombarded with all of these other writings, and that overwhelmed me? No, it's not the case. There's something called the free market of ideas. There's plenty of material that one has access to that's not Calvinistic. I read everything I could get my hands on when I became a new believer. The closest I came to Calvinism was Jonathan Edwards' sermon, which had been probably strongly edited out on sinners in the hands of an angry God. I'm sure that wasn't the whole sermon; it was just parts of it. John R. Rice in The Sword of the Lord, he would publish some Calvinistic works, but he would edit out the stronger doctrines that he felt were what he called hyper-Calvinism, which actually was Calvinism. So it's not that they weren't there, but it was being suppressed. And in the free market of ideas, that which is good is going to rise to the top. And what happened to me as I was searching, I came to a point, and I have this on my other channel. We go into great detail when I left the Hyles movement and the fundamentalism. And when I call it fundamentalism, I mean the hyper-fundamentalism. When I left that, I began searching for what was truth. Where could I find accurate Bible teaching and theology? And I began to find in God's providence books which weren't really that popular at that time, but they came into my hands. I read some of the Puritans, Thomas Watson. Somebody gave me a book called The Sovereignty of God by A.W. Pink. Or Albert Martin was a Reformed Baptist fellow. I'm not sure if he's still alive or not. I heard some of his sermon tapes. Ernie Reisinger was another one, that had some very good books on evangelism and other things, which I knew that there was problems there in fundamentalism. Ian Murray put out several books, and one was The Invitation System, where he evaluated the invitation system as it's given in the modern evangelical church, compared it to the Bible. Walter Chantry was another. I read several of his books. And, of course, John Owen and several others that I had been reading, and I began to see the quality of the writing as compared to what I was finding among the fundamentalists and Southern Baptists and some evangelicals, that these guys were tackling things that the other guys weren't. And so I was attracted to that. And I found that there's really very little comparison between the two when you get to the depth. So it wasn't the easy access to the material which led me into Calvinism. It was the quality of the material and the precision, the theological precision of the material, which drew me into that way of thinking. I think that when you really consider his argument I think he's assuming that these people are just stupid. They're going to believe everything that falls into their hands. The problem is there is a lot of junk on the internet. There's a lot of the other side. He says Google Calvinism, Google predestination. Well, if you do, you're not only going to find a lot of material by Calvinists, because we do use this medium. This is the great equalizer. That used to be that the other side could hide Calvinism and suppress it. They can't anymore because of the internet. I never had access to Calvinistic works like we have today. But there's plenty of other material out there. If you Google, there's a fellow, I can't think of his name, I think his name's Kevin, who has many anti-Calvinistic videos he calls Beyond the Fundamentals. I think he would be in agreement with much of Leighton Flowers' theology. There's probably a lot of areas he doesn't agree. I don't know for sure. But he's constantly pumping out anti-Calvinistic videos. These videos are an hour and a half long, some of them. Of course, you can find Stephen Anderson and the new IFB. They're constantly preaching against Calvinism. I don't give much stock to them theologically, but they do turn some minds in their direction. You can find Adrian Rogers. It's a 44-minute sermon on predestination, which is not Calvinistic. There are several others that you'll find there. Many of them very much anti-Calvinistic. So it's not that it's not there. If you want it, you can see both sides. But it is that these ideas are being presented, and there's something called the free market of ideas. And when you have a young mind who loves Christ and wants to learn what the scriptures teach and what is accurate biblical theology, now there's a means to compare that where it wasn't there before. Let me encourage you. There's a little 8-minute video on predestination by Dwayne Spencer. Now, I was familiar with Dwayne Spencer from one book that I read. I was confronted with the issue of mode of baptism when I was an assistant pastor in a Methodist church. And I was considering ordination through this group as a fundamentalist Methodist group. And in order to be ordained through this group, I had to be able to baptize by sprinkling. In other words, they didn't force you to not baptize by immersion. They simply said that the mode of baptism is something that can be debated. And I never thought it was, because I was never presented with the other side. Well, one of the books that was given to me was by this fellow, Dwayne Spencer. And I think it was a very good presentation. It helped me to see the other side of the mode of baptism. Now, this fellow also is now on the internet. He had a radio ministry. Much of his teaching was recorded. He's long gone. But he has this little 8-minute video on predestination. Now, if you just look at that one, compare that with some of the other things that you see out there on the internet, and you'll see why that Dr. Flowers is having difficulty with the massive amount of information that's out there on Calvinism. Is because of the quality of it, because of the thoroughness, and it covers areas that many of these men have been reluctant to do so, because it brings out the fact that they are deficient in much of their teaching. But you can't hide that anymore. It used to be prior to the internet, you could discourage people from reading things. You could encourage them to read only anti-Calvinistic material, but now it's there. And if people are browsing, they're going to have to choose between different thoughts, different ways of viewing theology. And they're going to, if they're interested, they can view everything. And the best of the theological presentation is something that they're going to be attracted to if they're interested in the truth. So I believe that's what's happening. Now, if I have time, I may go more in detail in some of Dr. Flowers' teaching in this little video, because he does cover some other things. But if you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section. May the Lord bless you in your search for truth.